This wasn't a video I had planned, but I wanted to make it for those of you who'd been waiting on my next UK post office scandal video, because you've been waiting for a while, so I'm squeezing this one in for you, and it's where I bring a bit more psychology into the scandal to tackle a question that sits at the heart of many of the testimonies we heard at the inquiry. And that question is, was the scandal caused by terrible people working at the post office, or was it that the post office was a terrible place to work? In other words, should we blame the person or the place? At the public inquiry into the post office scandal, we heard testimony after testimony where people shifted between two explanations for their behaviour. Sometimes they blamed the individual, though rarely themselves.
You take it completely as the truth because you assume that lawyers, and I must be clear, I'm not implying anything here at all in terms of Susan Crichton, but one assumes that lawyers work to a professional code.
And sometimes they pointed to the system, a dysfunctional organisation with a long history of problems.
An organisation that was in, I don't think it's any exaggeration to say it was in deep crisis.
So we're left with a fundamental question: do we blame the person or the place? And here's how, as a critical psychologist, I'd answer that. And I'd start with a formula. This formula is, in my view, at least, the most important for anyone trying to understand human behaviour. It's simple but powerful. Now, I'm not selling you magic beans, though psychology does tend to do that. What I am doing is giving you a thing that you can use to get the answer to the question, why did someone behave in the way they did? And because it's a formula, it uses variables. You still have to plug in the right values into those variables, and that's the hard part. But the formula itself is easy. It comes from Lewin. Lewin was a psychologist. He was born in 1890 in what was then Prussia, now Poland, and he moved to Germany in 1905, studied philosophy and psychology, and became associated with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, where a lot of critical psychology has its roots. When Hitler and the Nazis rose to power in Germany, Lewin fled to the US because he was Jewish, and that was a death sentence in Nazi Germany. He went on to become a major figure in American psychology, and he's now considered to be the founder of social psychology. Sadly, he died quite young in 1947 without ever returning to Germany. Now, one of his most influential contributions is this formula here. And this formula means human behaviour is a function of the person and the environment that the person is in. B is behaviour, P is the person, E is the environment or place, and F stands for function. And it tells us that we can't fully understand human behaviour by focusing only on the person or the environment. We need both. And if we leave one out, we don't just get a poor explanation, we risk things going seriously wrong. So I'm going to explore those risks with you, and after that I'll offer you a small revision to Lewin's formula, not to replace it, but to build on it. But first, I want to show you how two well-known psychologists leaned into different sides of this formula as they try to answer the same question we're asking today. Do people do bad things because they're bad people, or because they're in a bad place? Now, both these psychologists were trying to understand the horrors of Nazi Germany, and both offered very different answers. Their names were Stanley Milgram and Theodore Adorno. Now, I've got a couple of videos on all of this, which are part of my teaching videos on critical social psychology. I'll put the direct links in the description box if you want to dive deeper. But for now, here's a quick summary. Theodore Adorno was born in 1903, 13 years after Lewin, and like Lewin, he studied philosophy and psychology in Germany, and he had links with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory as well. And also like Lewin, he fled Germany in the 1930s because Hitler came to power and because Lewin, he was Jewish. Unlike Lewin, though, Adorno returned to Germany after the war and in 1950 published The Authoritarian Personality. And Adorno died, again quite young, 1969 at the age of 65. Stanley Milgram, he was born in the US in 1933. He didn't experience Nazi Germany firsthand, but like Lewin and Adorno, he was Jewish, and the Holocaust deeply influenced his work, and in 1963 he published his now famous and still controversial studies on obedience. Both Adorno and Milgram were trying to answer the same question. How could ordinary people participate in something as horrific as the Holocaust? Milgram's answer wasn't that people were inherently bad, it was that the situation they were in made them behave in the way they did. He blamed the place, not the person. Adorno, well, he came to the opposite conclusion. He believed certain people have a personality type, a tendency to blindly obey authority that makes them more likely to commit harmful acts. He called this the authoritarian personality. So for Adorno, the problem was with the person, not the place. Now, neither of these guys produced flawless research. Both Milgram and Adorno based their conclusions on studies that had serious methodological flaws and serious ethical issues. But here's the twist. Adorno's work was widely accepted while Milgram's work was heavily criticised. And this might have been because in the post-war years, the public wasn't ready to accept that ordinary people could do evil things argument. The public preferred then, and they probably still do, preferred the argument that the Nazis did bad things because the Nazis were bad people. So, to bring it back to Levin's formula, Adorno erased the E, the environment, and focused on the P, the person, whilst Milgram did the opposite. He erased the P and focused on the E. Now, let's look at those risks of only blaming the person and the risks of only blaming the place. If you believe bad things happen because bad people do bad things, it can shut down your ability to empathize with the bad guys. I mean, hey, who'd want to walk in their shoes? They're bad. You wouldn't want to empathize with them, would you? And the other problem is when you're operating like that with the good and the bad, separating out the good and the bad, you're dividing the world into good and bad, and that's polarizing, and that rarely ends well, unless you're into conflict or into Facebook. Also, when we split people into good and bad, most of us will see ourselves as the good ones, and that leads you very quickly to look arrogant and self-righteous to the ones you've labelled as bad, and that can lead to bad outcomes for everyone. This is the thing that might help explain why Trump got voted in again, and the US is now starting to barrel down into an authoritarian fascist state. Well, it's looking that way at the moment. They just arrested a judge today as I was filming this. Anyway, that's another issue. But there's a final issue here in relation to just focusing on the person and blaming the person. What if you're wrong? What if it's not bad people, but it's a bad system? If you purge the rotten apples from the barrel, not realizing the barrel is rotten, the next batch of apples you put in there will rot too. You'll just repeat the cycle. Focusing on toxic individuals while ignoring the environment that made them toxic in the first place can be a real problem. So, how about the other side of this? What about the risks of blaming the place rather than the person? Here are the risks. When we focus too much on circumstance, too much on the environment, the thing that's surrounding the behaviour, people can slip out of accountability. They claim they meant well, that they were victims of the system, And we often let that pass. We give them the benefit of the doubt. Meanwhile, the people who were harmed are left without justice. They're asked to be understanding, to forgive, and if they're lucky, they might get an apology. But it will be a hollow apology because the person offering it doesn't believe they did anything wrong because it was the system that was to blame as far as they're concerned. And when there are no consequences for the wrongdoer, they can carry on doing wrong. Blaming the system can create a toxic environment, one where harmful behaviour is quietly tolerated. The narrative shifts. Instead of being angry about injustice, we start to feel sorry for the wrongdoers. It's like how awful it is that they were put in such a situation that led them to do such a bad thing. Suddenly the wrongdoer gets as much compassion as the victims, sometimes even more, and the worst wrongdoers can exploit that. On top of that, refusing to punish the wrongdoers can muddy an organisation's moral compass. If no one's held accountable, it starts to look like the behaviour of those bad actors is acceptable. The values of the organisation erode, and then, ironically, the system does become the problem. So what's the solution here? It's that formula. The formula from Kurt Lewin. Behaviour is a function of the person and the environment. It's not one or the other. It's both things. But sometimes it is more one than the other because taking into account the importance of place doesn't always let the bad actor off the hook. It can skewer them. If the place is one where they should have known better, should have acted better, and where they had every opportunity to do better, but also when it's a place of their making. And this gets us to the need to adjust the Lewin equation a little bit, do a little bit of tinkering to take that into account. If we swap the E and the B around, we get this, which is that we have the environment as a function of the person and their behaviour. Now, what I mean by this is that people are shaped by the environments they're in, but they also in turn shape those environments, and those who are in positions of power get to shape those environments in a big way. So a CEO of an organisation or a chair of a board, so the likes of Paula, pass me another tissue, Vendels, and Tim, do you mind if I stick my hands down my pants, Parker? Well, they aren't victims of a poorly functioning organisation. They're responsible for the poorly functioning organisation. Their behaviour wasn't shaped by a bad environment. Their behaviour was what caused the bad environment. And if the environment was bad, it was up to them to fix it, and they didn't. Instead, they made it worse. So if they were victims of circumstance, victims of the environment, the place that they were in, well, it was of their own making. So I think we should take into account the person and the environment, but the outcome can be that the blame for wrongdoing is proportioned almost fully on the person. But I have a lingering worry, which is that those without real power in the organisation, in post office, will end up with most of the blame, while those at the top may escape accountability. The post office executive, the Fujitsu executives, the politicians, because they will likely rely on the bad set of circumstances excuse for their bad behaviour. And those deciding their fate might sympathise because they can imagine themselves in similar positions of authority as those executives and those politicians, because they are in those positions of authority themselves. When people in positions of authority assess the behaviour of other people in positions of authority, they can too readily see those other people as victims of circumstance because they too may have been accused of wrongdoing, and when it happened to them, it was because they were a victim of circumstance, or at least that's how they think about it. And there are two psychological processes that explain things here. The first relates to that work done by Milgram. One of the things his studies on obedience showed was that proximity matters. We're more likely to harm someone when there's distance, physical or social, between us and the person we're harming. If the person you're causing harm to isn't in the room with you, in the same organisation as you, or is just someone who's not like you, well, it becomes easier to do them harm because you can more easily disconnect from that person and the consequences of the harm that you do. That's why people are so cruel online. It's easier to insult someone who's just an avatar on a screen than it is when you see them in person. Second is the self-serving bias, which is part of something psychologists call attribution theory. It's basically a common sense thing wrapped up in a fancy wrapper, given the name of a theory and makes it sound scientific and all that. Psychology does that a lot, wraps up common sense and pretends it's something special. And what this theory says is that we credit our successes to our own abilities and blame our failures on external factors. In Kurt Levin's formula, B equals FPE, we amplify the P, our personal attributes, when understanding our successes, and we emphasize the E, the environment, the contextual stuff, the setting, the place we're in, when we're understanding our failures. And when someone likes us, when someone like us messes up, like I just messed up, I'll start that again. So when it's a hot studio I'm in, which is making me trip over my words. See what I'm doing there? Anyway, when someone like us messes up, we're tempted to blame that person's stuff up on the situation they're in, not on the type of person they are, because they're the same type of person we are. And that's the risk when people in positions of authority engage in wrongdoing that's investigated by other people in positions of authority. Now, we've got to hope that that doesn't happen here with the Post Office inquiry. We've got Lewin, the chair of the inquiry, in charge of it all. And for some reason, I've got a bit of hope here that it'll be okay. I'm not sure why. I think it might be his Welsh accent that makes me think that he's more working class than he actually is. So it might just be my prejudice that's kicking in here. But I'm hoping that, that they don't let the people in those executive positions off the hook. I'd be interested to hear what you think. Are you hopeful? Do you want them let off the hook? Let me know. So anyway, let's conclude. So I want to conclude with one final thing. Now, I used to work in community psychology before I shifted over to critical psychology. Community psychology, I've got other videos which talk about what that is, but one important thing for the field, for this area of psychology, is that they have this core belief that we should avoid blaming individuals for problems that are structural. And it's one of the reasons I left community psychology. I became uneasy with how crudely it was applied. The commitment to avoiding blame became like a moral absolute, applied to everyone, everywhere, and it flattened the moral landscape and let those who most often did the greatest wrongs, those in positions of power and authority, it let them off the hook. And those without power, with no authority, were left with nothing but a stinking heap of empty apologies. But that moral absolute of not blaming the individual still gives me a kind of a twinge of discomfort when I argue that someone should be blamed, when I'm focusing on individuals rather than the system. But when it comes to the post office scandal, here's the thing that helps me move past that discomfort and stops me twinging. I just remember how those executives at the post office, they didn't hesitate to blame the individual. It was their first instinct. And worse, they blamed those who had the least power, the sub-postmasters. They didn't blame the broken IT system, even though it was clearly broken, or blame the dysfunctional management structure, even though it was clearly dysfunctional. They ignored evidence, dismissed complaints, and clung to a story that protected their own interests. So yeah, I'm happy to point the finger at them. Are you? What do you think? I don't know. I'd like to hear. Anyway, we should wrap this video up. I hope you got something useful from that. Do give me a thumbs up if you did. Leave a comment. I do read through all the comments, even though it takes me an age to reply to them all. And if you haven't subscribed, consider subscribing. It's free, and having subscribers helps keep my bosses off my back. More about that in a future video. Okay, I'll say ta-da now. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Ta-da.